Yeah. Or it can start 5 minutes late. Yeah. That should be right. So yeah, you use those for the perhaps I've got like 10.
very quiet, please? Can we settle down? We're already 5 minutes late, so let's crack on.
Okay, good afternoon. My name's Alice James, and today I'm going to be talking about exploring the divide between research-based and commercial archaeological geophysics. Generally, there is considered a divide between research-based and commercial geophysics. However, many commercial archaeological companies do have an element of research within their company. Today, I'm going to be using case studies from two companies. One is based in Italy, the British School at Rome, who I previously worked with, and the second is AOC Archaeology. AOC Archaeology has a keen interest in research, both promoting the research interests of its staff members, as well as having heavy involvement in community archaeology projects. And the British School at Rome, although kind of worked within a commercial framework, works largely with academic institutions and universities. So again, is able to continue a large element of archaeological research in the work it does. So ultimately, the aim of any survey or the role of an archaeological geophysicist is the same, regardless of whether we're in research or in commercial archaeology. It's to do the best for the archaeology, to create the best documentation of potential archaeology, whether that's establishing what the best technique is, where possible, using multi-methodological survey, and generally just having a very good understanding of the potential archaeology we're trying to identify. I'm now going to explore a couple of areas where there's the potential for difference between research and commercial, and how we can kind of maybe use both to kind of develop and better the kind of the geophysics we're doing. So first of all, we have data collection. The way we collect our data is largely dependent on the project brief we're dealing with. So whether that's a research project, a community project or community training, or a commercial style project. And so depending on these, this will affect the data collection. So for example, the resolution we're going to use, the survey area size, the possibility of a multi-methodological survey. So using very, very general terms, in a research style, you'll probably be using a higher resolution. If where possible, you'll be trying to use as many techniques to try and identify the problem you're trying to solve. Whereas in commercial, you might be using a lower resolution, a larger survey area, and you might not be able to actually use a multi-methodological due to the time and cost constraints. Also, we have to kind of examine who's actually collecting the data. So whether that's a geophysicist, an archaeologist, or a trained or untrained non-professional. In terms of research, generally you find there's a different variety of people that will be collecting data. So in a lot of research projects, there'll be more scope for training. So you'll have more untrained people, whether that's archaeology students who are kind of getting the experience, or just people from a community who want to kind of be involved in geophysics and so want to learn about the kind of geophysics. Next, we have data visualization. Now, traditionally in a report, we'll generally provide kind of grayscale plots. This will all relate to gradient survey, but I think it transfers across to other survey techniques as well. Maybe XY trace plots. However, there are other quick and cheap methods that are easily accessible, which we can use to display our data. Now, something we've been playing with at AOC is using these methods. So, for example, these examples are all done using Blender, and here you can use a displacement modifier that references the texture as a height source. And so from this, you can create different images which kind of characterize your data slightly differently, and can be quite useful in kind of highlighting areas within the data, and could potentially be used quite well for interpretation. So if you play around with kind of the colors and the light contrast, you get some nice images, and they draw out the different features quite nicely. And what's also nice with this is, by using software like this, you can then combine your geophysics data with other survey techniques which you've used on a site. So for example, we recently, it's not this example, but on another site, in Scotland near Perth, we recently did geophysics and laser scanning on a 4-poster site. And we're now looking at combining the two data sets so that we can try and visualize both what's above the ground and what's underneath the ground. And so this can be quite useful in research into kind of different ways to display data and helping people kind of understand like the archaeology and what's going on. It's where the PowerPoint doesn't work. Okay, next we have data interpretation. Now, ultimately with data interpretation, we both want to make it accessible, but also easy to understand. However, there's several issues in this, and I think these have come up today quite a lot. The level to which you should interpret data, it can be quite difficult. How much detail should you go into? What type of categories should we be using? Now, this example is from a site in Italy called Seni in Lazio. And we created two kind of interpretations for this. First of all, we created an interpretation where we outlined positive, negative anomalies and then kind of areas of disturbance. And then from that, we created a schematic interpretation which applied archaeological interpretation. And with a site like this, unfortunately, I haven't got the kind of the grayscale to go with it, but where it's difficult to try and determine what the archaeology is going on, this can be quite useful as it kind of makes features potentially easier to understand. However, on some sites, this probably isn't very time effective as you're potentially producing two maps. And if you're doing something like ground penetrating radar and you're using multiple kind of time slices, then it's going to take more time. This interpretation, which was done by my former colleague, Matt Berry, kind of does mixes the two together, where this site is a site called Peltrinum in the Abruzzo, and we're looking at a plan of a Roman town. And you can see on the interpretations, the areas kind of drawn around in brown. These are the roads which are running through, and then in between that you have the potential for various structures, which he's kind of made more schematic. And so again, with a complicated data set like this, you just want to make it easy to understand. And so the person looking at it can see how it directly corresponds with the data that's been collected. Similarly, at AOC, we've been trying to kind of develop and create a good categorization for what we're interpreting. So for things like plough lines, whether that's ridge and furrow or more modern kind of ploughing, creating the lines across, and then using like a draw round to actually interpret your data. Finally, I'm going to go on to data scrutiny, which again I think has been brought up quite a lot. This again is from the site in Seni, and the nice thing about this site is at the British School at Rome, we worked with the museum in Seni as this 3-year kind of project to kind of better characterise and work out what the archaeological remains in their town were doing. So we targeted 3 sites. This is taken from the main piazza in their town, so you can imagine what the people thought when we said we're going to do a survey and then we're going to dig up your piazza. But eventually they came through and that was fine. So we did a ground penetrating radar survey. I've just focused in on the area that was then excavated. The survey took less than a day, and then over a period of 3 weeks, there was then an excavation, and as you can see, these two perfectly match up. Now, the beauty of this is the fact that because we did the geophysics survey and then were able to be involved in the excavation, we're able to see how the results in the excavation perfectly, they work together. Now, in this case, this is the perfect example of when the geophysics and the interpretation pretty much match what you're seeing in the excavation. However, and likewise in companies like AOC Archaeology, because we through our kind of various departments, we're able to offer a variety of different archaeological services, and because we have good communication in our company, when we have a geophysics survey, we can then communicate with the other departments who are doing further archaeological investigation, whether that's excavation or other forms of survey. And through that communication, we can both scrutinize our data and see how our interpretations relate to each other. But also this is incredibly useful for a kind of anomaly to feature recognition. By seeing the type of features that are coming up to how you're kind of interpreting your anomalies is a quite useful task for your development and kind of being able to kind of develop data sets to a high level. So I think I've talked really quickly because apparently we're behind and James wants to spend loads of time talking. But I've used this as a kind of way to kind of outline several areas which I feel that commercial geophysics can potentially benefit from research, and research can benefit from commercial, and so we can use the two in tandem. But also how commercial companies, through their work with community groups, also by kind of setting up links with universities and things like this, not only do we have the option to help train people, but we also get to work on sites where we can develop our interpretation capacities, identifying which are the best survey techniques, all this kind of thing, which might seem a bit textbook, but it makes us be able to constantly evolve in what we're doing. So I'd like to give a massive thank you to the British Scholar Rome and the SANY project for letting me use their data today. And again, I've probably spoken ridiculously fast, so I apologise, but you can talk to me in more detail afterwards.
Just open discussion. I think to carry on from Simon's comments during the tea break there, in refining the interpretations so they're not so descriptive to the actual anomaly shapes, is that taking that Roman road settlement and you had clear 3 roads going in there, to go even further and just mark them as straight lines. You know, that's what they generally are. So looking back on that and saying, I know there's obviously going to be a limit to how much you can do that because you're starting to over-interpolate data, but it makes it more archaeologically real. That's the key. Yes, Jerry.
Well, all I was going to say is, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you are offering an interpretation. You're not offering a coloured version of the data plot, which, you know, I've sat there with data plots in front of me and I've judiciously gone through it and I've tried to pick out what I think is right, and I've sort of stood back from it and gone, well, that just looks like a colour version of the grayscale I started with, which is no use to a client. They're paying me to try and advise them on what I think is there. So yeah, I think that there is a balance to be struck between the two.
Absolutely, and once again, reiterate, it is vital that they have a cultural understanding when they're interpreting the geophysical story, because that is the ultimate aim, certainly when it comes to planning applications.
That's the difference between digitizing and interpreting, because digitizing just contour level of where is 0.5 nanotesla over time and making wiki anomaly to them.
Yes.
But I know for CAGS that sometimes it's really hard when you've got some really strong anomaly, really complex, really amorphous, to get something out of it that doesn't look this way. But
I think there needs to be like a balance, because ultimately you want to make what you're trying to say in regards to the archaeology that's there is easy to see, but at the same time you don't want to give someone something and they say, how do these two images actually relate to each other? So there needs to be a slight balance. I mean, it's in the same way with when you're doing an interpretation, does it need to be more scientific or does it need to be more archaeological? I mean, how do you go about, because an interpretation is actually quite a difficult thing to sometimes do, and the categories I think are essential. If you can somehow get those right and the way you're going to go about your interpretation, then
I think that
you can
in
create.
place is good to go into that kind of interpretation, and I'm starting to think that maybe a way of doing that is more by an overlay of the interpretation over the data. Which means that you got the data in the background, you see what's happening, you don't need to draw that again and again and spend hours digitizing the wiggly bits like that, but having some shade drawn on top, and I'm trying to do things at the moment, but it's really hard to move on from the whole habitude you've got of how you learn and how you do things.
I think one of the very important bits about interpretation is that we document what we do. So we may well say this is purely tracing the geophysical anomalies, or this is more or less an imaginative way of interpreting archaeological features as they may be. But there needs to be a statement in the report saying, I have derived my interpretation using whatever method or whatever thought behind this. So I think
that's why the British Water Roma is able to play with both doing a kind of where you draw around, which this is slightly more time consuming, and then on top of that do a schematic, because then you get the balance. So one is purely anomaly based. You're just saying there's an anomaly there and that's its kind of shape, I've drawn around it. But the second one is an actual interpretation, because you're then saying, well, this is the type of archaeology I think that's there. But like I said, this can be quite time consuming, where if, let's say, you've got time pressures that you need to produce a report very quickly, you're not going to have time to sit there and do that.
I think we one more.
I was just going to say, I think it is important to have these two levels of interpretation. So in the first level, you are defining your anomalies, if you like, and you're saying this is a positive, negative. And then a second layer of interpretation, which is the archaeological, a bit more subjective, obviously. But then you can say, we've got this sort of anomaly, it's likely to reflect this. And I think it's important to have that to sort of try and justify how you might come to your archaeological interpretation. But the problem we then have is we might produce an archaeological interpretation plot with all these potential archaeological features on it, and then the client comes back to us and it'll be, well, these can't really all be archaeological, can they? Well, on the basis of the geophysical anomalies, if you like, they could be, yes. You can rule out things like land drains and pipes, and there are various others. Modern things you can discount. So, well, let's have a compromise. Can you give us an interpretation plan and distinguish between probable and possible archaeology? Now, that to me is, what's that all about? A potential archaeological feature is a potential archaeological feature.
I think there are.
If it's in a nice pattern,
when you've got something incredibly obvious, you can stick it into a probable likely.
You can in your kind of description maybe go into more information.
Well, I just think, if we just went on forward, then the square feature would be archaeology, wouldn't it?
Yes.
I think the crucial thing is the textual descriptions that go with the categories.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've got I think the most important thing about a report is the fact that if you say ditch, that somebody else knows what you mean by the word ditch. And if you say possible ditch, there's some inkling as to why there is a difference between the two. And so I think it's the backup information that is crucial to understanding an interpretation point.
That's very yeah, absolutely true. Yeah, because of course in your interpretation drawing, your final interpretation about the archaeological, you can only show one scenario. There may be 3 or 4 different interpretations of any given feature or anything.
Yeah, and once again, geophysics will often be a suite of programming archaeological investigations, so that doesn't often stop right there. But I think we should move on. We've got commercial geophysics in Norway up next.
Go right handed up. Oh, yeah. Yeah, there we go.
Lovely.
So there you go. Hello. My name is Arne. I'm a trained archaeologist. I have a master's degree in archaeology from Norway, and then I went over here and did a master's in archaeological prospection a couple of years later. That was in 2010. This presentation here is mainly graphs and statistics, but I think you'll find it interesting anyways. I hope so anyways. It's based on an article I co-wrote with a colleague of mine from the Norwegian Institute of Cultural Heritage Research, who's just became a father and he's not here. He wanted to be here, he might be online for all I know. I don't. Anyways, most of this is available in an article that it's just published actually, and it's a book called A Sense of the Past: Studies in Current Archaeological Applications of Remote Sensing and Non-Invasive Prospection Methods. It's a Bar International Journal, but the article is actually just as we speak available on academia if you want to download it. So there's some free commercial there. Anyways, geophysics in Norway. This is the story, basically, over time on the development of geophysics in Norway. When it comes to the amount of surveys, it's been perceived as something. Can I point this? Yeah, that's something it's a lot of media coverage and a lot of the archaeological communities say that geophysics is something new. It's nothing we know anything about. But looking at this, you can clearly see that it actually has a history and it's picking up. That's the main point of that. It started with a guy called Richard Binns who bought a FM, started to be 36, and then he upgraded it. That's it. You know what? He's a geologist. He's not a trained archaeologist, and he started to do some service early on. Then one of the county archaeologists had a project with the National Antiquarian on geophysical methods in 2006, and they started to pick up from there. We acquired some kit back in 2008 and 2009, and then NICU, together with LBR, you should say NICU here as well, they started to do quite a bit of stuff. So since 2010, about 24 of those 71 surveys are NICUs. No, 24 is LBI, 29 is NICU by themselves. They got a georadar kit, and I did about 29 of them as well. So starting to get some experience, but it's a bit of a delay compared to the development in the UK. And the reasons for that are several. There's a kind of an existing skepticism on the usage of geophysics. Mainly, I would say it's a limited understanding of geophysics and the way how geophysical methods can be applied for their archaeological purpose, whatever the purpose is, and also knowledge on the technical limitations and possibilities. Also, access to articles and to published data and reports is limited. There's no one that teaches archaeological geophysics. We're pretty good on oil exploration geophysics, but it's not always directly translatable below our oil. But also some of the early surveys specifically had some technical limitations. So the resolution was poorer than it is today, the gathering speed, and also some elements of maybe overselling the potential, and also maybe some bad data interpretation. But it's changing. Just a short example of an early data plot. This one, it's early. It's from '94 or something, but it's still some. You've got some archaeology, a Prado burial mound, and you've got quite a bit of stuff going on. But you can see that it's not always that interpretation that's been published. I can't really match it up with that, especially from my archaeological training. I think it's over imaginative, and then people come back to a map like this and then go and test trench and say, I didn't find any of those burial mounds, and at least not that house. And how can you be sure that black blob there is a postal? And that's something that often can explain some of the reluctancy that's in there back home. Also, discrete or ephemeral archaeology. This is from an excavation last year. I'll show a geophysical map later on. It's not from this site, but a similar site, but just for visualization purposes. You got rows of post holes, you got a over 40-meter long house, and some cooking pits in there, and so on and so forth. This is the plan. So usually the post holes aren't bigger than half a meter in diameter, maybe that deep for all I know. Sometimes more, sometimes less. But archaeologists expect a method that you apply to be able to detect this. And it's not always that you are able to detect that. Like this, for instance, all the yeah, what color is that? Yes, yellowish. They're post holes, and the red ones are cooking pits, and that's that bit basically. So you can quite a few of the cooking pits from this site specifically you can pick up. You got some anomalies that are fairly similar, but they didn't show up on the test trench or the backhoe excavation surface. So it creates somewhat of a difficulty in relying on interpretations. And this is something that I'm working on specifically is how to categorize anomalies and how to maybe visualize patterns of anomalies to see if they condense at certain areas, and you can use that to delimit sites, for instance. Anyways, cultural heritage management in Norway, short introduction. The Directorate for Cultural Heritage, also called Riksantikvaren, they are responsible for the practical implementation of the Norwegian Cultural Heritage Act, the laws that we have to abide to, basically. Counties, if you have a planning permission, it's the county archaeologist that does that. Archaeology is not privatized as it is in England. So they go out, they do the test trenching or decide actually what method they want to continue with. If they find something, the developer wants to continue, he goes to the regional archaeological museums that does the excavations. That's where I come in. I'm doing a PhD at the university, which is also has a regional archaeological museum where I'm employed. They do the archaeological investigation and they manage the object collections and undertake research. And NICU is somewhat the only one out because they're private, but they have a state obligation for medieval towns and churches. So they're kind of strange in between. They also operate as a research institute. And if you see who commissions geophysical surveys, and also the total number of surveys initiated for research purposes versus management purposes, you get quite an interesting number. When I say management purposes, that is site development plans, but also dissemination projects, or geophysical projects undertaken to disseminate knowledge to the public. And it's not always that easy to say if this is a research project or a management project or a cultural management project. Still, 63% research projects, 37% of all projects initiated in Norway are from a management point of view. It's not really a big number. But you see also that the counties, although overall it's about 20% of all surveys, 73% of all the surveys they've been responsible for are management. So it kind of adds up, and you also see, of course, quite a lot of research going on in NICU and LBI. Also, quite a few local municipalities have done some stuff, and some often there you got local museums and all that are more interested in learning about whatever it is that they're presenting at their university. This is roughly where geographically it is in Norway, and well, I work there. I'm from that county, so obviously, and Richard Bins lives there as well from RBG work, so that kind of explains a lot of the concentration there. LBI is working together with the county archaeologists in Vestfold. So the 63 surveys in Vestfold is mainly due to their original project from 2006 and their collaboration with LBI. And apart from that, there's quite a lot of variation, which is interesting. Even more interesting, if you look at the numbers of archaeological investigations in the counties compared to the number of geophysical projects they've initiated. And this is between 2007 and 2011. That's what I have the numbers for. There's no correlation on who performs geophysical what's it called? Undertake geophysical surveys and commission them, and where things are done. So there's no link between the amount of work they do when it comes to site development and archaeological investigations and who does geophysics. Interesting. Also quite interesting is the choice of methods and the number of geophysical methods applied on each project, which can also sometimes explain some of the reluctance on why it hasn't been used more. I think you'll probably be surprised by this number, about 41% involves GPR. Only 41% of GPR magnetometers are used just about as much. This is the number of surveys, it's not the size of the service, by the way. Earth resistance is quite low. There's a reason for that. No one owns one. But we also got some ERT equipment, and it's been used every once in a while by some company. And other is various EMI and MagSUS. So if anyone wants to get rid of an RM15 or anything, just call me. That's fine. I have several places where you can use that. But also, back to the number of methods, you see only about like 74% of all surveys undertaken have only used one method. So it could very well be that they should have applied another method as well on top of that. Also, this is a short one. The same settlements that we know often have very ephemeral archaeology. We don't have these enclosures. We don't have like huge roadways and ditches and stuff. We've got pits and post holes, which is difficult to detect. So maybe, even though a lot of the survey has been undertaken to find and locate settlements, maybe not, that wasn't the best potential target, or you should have done things in a different way. This one is a burial mound that's boat-shaped. It's about 32 meters long, which is quite cool. Also, you should expect these ones, like stone buildings and medieval settlements, to be maybe more easy to locate. But then again, we don't have huge masteries and fancy Roman stuff. Slightly envious on that. That's how it is. And it's just the development of the usage of methods, various methods over time. So, GPR going up, earth resistance going down, and I do quite a bit of work involving MagSUS, so that can explain some of that. Recent development. The Norwegian University of Science and Technology, NTNU, and the Museum there of Natural History and Archaeology, we've bought some kit. We have an ERT equipment, a Partington MS2D, and an ERT system, and NICU have their own georadar, and they collaborate with LBI and do a lot of good work. And the resolution is increasing, the data gathering speed is increasing, and also the computing power. And also the understanding of the need for well-developed aims and objectives, and the reasons why you choose to deploy geophysical methods. Some of the early services, mainly, we got this cool project, we got some extra money, let's bring in some people, often doing good technical work, but lacking communication with archaeologists. So, and often not based in Norway, which then means that they do the survey, they hand over the report, time's running out, and basically the knowledge is gone, the communication possibilities are limited, and the potential to learn from it is less so good. So let's see, well, new stuff going on. Snowmobiles and GPR. That's fun. I also did a 4.6 hectare survey in that much snow with a 3D radar behind the tractor. I learned to drive a tractor. That was fun. Of course, you recognize all the LBI stuff, and some results. This is a cooking pit thing, like a gathering place, and it's getting there. We're starting to find stuff. I think I'm gonna that's just the development. You see development over time between research-based surveys and cultural heritage management surveys. So the number of surveys involving cultural heritage management projects are increasing. And it's kind of strange that geophysical methods isn't used more when you look at very nice words like the ICOMOS Charter and the Valletta Convention saying that we should use non-invasive methods more. I don't know about England. You probably signed these as well, but I'm not sure how much, like how valid they are from a legal perspective. I'm going to try to figure that out. But also, the museum has a research project going on this. It's starting to become more and more popular. And this is where I'm back to the learning by doing, as I put in the title. I figured out I have to put it in the slide somewhere because we're in a position at my museum especially where I can go out, do a survey, and within half a year I'll get the archaeological feedback because the people that led the excavation lives right across the hall, or their office is right across the hall. So we've got the potential of speeding up the learning curve, you could say, on geophysics. Sadly, it's just me and a couple of guys in Oslo at NICU that are using geophysics within their research or have their own kit in Norway. But there's also quite a few other companies in there. So it's a small market, but the interest locally is increased, and we're really getting there. Let's see, can skip that. One of that. So that's your reference for the article if you want to read it. And if you have any questions, please ask me.
I'm going to kick off again, right?
That's okay.
No, you stay here. I'll ask you first. In terms of, you said there is a doubt for success for the magnetic survey picking up your discrete features because they're just too small. We obviously have a similar problem in this country, but if it's usually defined by a very big bank, in some circumstances, not in some circumstances. How does the GPR interpretation level up? Is there a greater success rate with GPR looking at those discrete features?
Still, again, often then if you're looking at postals, for instance, if you see a clear pattern, that's fine. It all adds up to a house. But if you just got random blobs, high reflective areas, it's hard to. I find it very hard, anyways, to try to distinguish if this is like a stone-filled post hole, or if it's just a stone. And and so, how do you distinguish natural anomalies from human-made, man-made anomalies? And I think that's a huge problem, and we're working on it. But it's a difficult thing. And then of course, if all you got is a field with random blobs, then can you then look at the distribution of all these blobs, and then that will make sense from a cultural historical perspective. Maybe you can. I did that on one site actually. This site here, where are we? I mean, this one, where I just mapped out all the blobs, all anomalies above a certain threshold, and then I did a kernel density analysis on the distribution pattern of those blobs, and that fitted very well with both MAGSAS and GPR data showing where the settlement activity was. Actually, that's not a settlement house, that's a boathouse from an Iron Age. Around 500 AD boathouse, 30 meters long. So there are other ways of approaching this. You can look at the variance in the magnetometer data to see if you can do some spatial patterning, or you can do several different things.
Yeah. Peter.
Peter Barber from Charles again. When you had the map of Norway, you had from the concentrations of where the geophysics has been done, which didn't, from what I understood, it doesn't reflect where the actual archaeology is in the ground. It just happens to reflect where the practitioners are. Is that right?
Yeah.
Do you think there's a similar correlation or lack of correlation between the techniques that you're using the very high proportion of GPR, because it just happens to be there's more people operating GPR in Norway than there are people with magnetometers.
Or happen to have one. And if you don't have own other equipment than the GPR kit, of course that's a problem. Of course, and there's several occasions where I've been asked to do a tender. I said, well, I'd recommend EMI or Earth Resistance, and I would like to do that, but we don't have a kit, so we have to borrow it if we're to do it. We had one tender, for instance, where it was a festival site. I think you had that close to Stonehenge as well, where you had all kinds of rubbish and all caps and whatnot and topsoil. But using EMI, you can do EMI inversions to various depth, and you can then just look at the depth underneath the festival area and get a good magnetic map of what's going on down there, and then reduce the amount of interference from the noise top. But then again, we didn't have an EMI device, so I can do it. But there are options. There are other options, and of course that's a problem also. That the number of practitioners is no university in Norway teaching archaeological geophysics, apart from the couple of lectures I do for my master's students every year. But that's it.
Okay, well, we're running out of time.
Sorry.
So if there's one more question, and maybe quick, or shall we move on? Anything?
Where am I sitting?
They should be in that corner.
I'll let you do it. Right, because I've got a lot to get through. Brief history of me, people that don't know me, I've been straddling the commercial and academic worlds for a little while now. I run Earth Sound Archaeological Geophysics in Ireland. I've been responsible for a lot of road scheme surveys carried out there. For the past 3.5 years, I've been carrying out my PhD here at Bradford. And my role in that has been to actually analyse all of the road scheme data from Ireland. So the National Roads Authority, who funded my PhD, want to know exactly where geophysics has worked on their road schemes, where it hasn't, and so forth. Over the last, okay, right. So I've been analysing a geophysical archive that spans 10 years, from 2001 to 2010. It covers 170 geophysical survey reports, represented by each of the red dots, or some of the long lines in case of actual longer road schemes, and 1,700 hectares of geophysical survey, distributed right across the country, various geologies, various different types of sites. In terms of the size of the archive, all of the National Roads Authority, the NRA data, represents about 16% of all the geophysical surveys carried out in Ireland between 2001 and 2010. So it's quite a big archive in terms of the whole country. Thanks to data such as we just had from Arnie there and from Andreas Weberg and Visser et al. For other countries, we can actually see that during that comparative 10-year period, the NRA surveys are actually much higher than all the survey outputs from Norway and the Netherlands. So it's quite a substantial archive. The estimate from the UK, by the way, is derived from the AIP database. So it's a bit contentious, there's probably far more than that. But it represents a fairly sizable archive. Why should you be interested in legacy data? We talked about it quite a lot already today in terms of feedback. We don't tend to get an awful lot of feedback as archaeological geophysicists, certainly not in Ireland, and there seems to be the general consensus here as well. I won't read out all these quotes, but they're all quotes that I've gathered from geophysicists that have worked on national road schemes, both in Ireland and British companies that work there as well. So they're genuine quotes, and generally feedback was fairly negative between curators, archaeologists, and the geophysicists. So by analysing all this data and actually seeing how accurate it was and what types of reports were produced, we can actually give a bit of feedback back to the geophysicists that carried out the surveys in the first place. 20 different contractors carried out the work. Most of them were from Ireland, but 26% of all the surveys were carried out by British companies. So the 20 contractors are listed there in alphabetical order. There's a few of you in the room already today. 5 of those companies were responsible for the vast majority of all the work. 77% were carried out by 5 companies. Now, that's not necessarily a guarantee of quality of those surveys, but it does guarantee a certain degree of consistency between them when we're looking at different styles of interpretation, how they collected the data and so forth, and their own procedures for processing it and whatnot. It's reasonably consistent spread amongst those 5 different companies. Arnie asked me a good question a few days ago. This is all very well, but were they any good? Were they very qualified at all? Now, because I know, at least I know of the names of the senior geophysicists who are behind all these companies, I can actually know a bit about their education and so forth as well. So I know, for example, that 47% of all the consultancies actually had at least one senior geophysicist, normally many more, that come through the Bradford route, either the MSc in ArcSky or the MSc in ArcProds. Now, we'll turn the microphone off. Just because you did geophysics at Bradford doesn't guarantee you're the world's best geophysicist. But again, it does guarantee... Sorry, you're supposed to cover your ears on it. But it does guarantee that you've got the best education that we can offer in this country in terms of archaeological geophysics. It does guarantee that most of those companies actually have people carrying out consistent data collection and processing methods as well. So there's a degree of consistency, but we can't necessarily say that it's quality as such. But I'm fairly happy with that. I mean, 86% of all the surveys were carried out by at least one person who has a connection here to Bradford. So that's fairly good as far as I'm concerned. They were mostly carried out by good archaeological geophysicists, if you like. So we took Armin Schmidt's database, basically, adapted it very slightly for Irish scenarios and added a few fields. But we took all of those reports, 170 of them, as part of the scoping exercise. We entered all of the database fields, taking data from those reports, putting it into Armin-style database to see what we got. What we did get was a series of quite serious omissions, we felt. These are some of the things that were missing percentage-wise from each of the geophysical reports. Now, weather conditions and soil conditions, and by soil conditions we're talking about wet soils, dry soils, that sort of thing, they were the most common emissions. And I can understand that myself. If you're only carrying out a magnetometer survey, you're probably not going to record, certainly the weather. That's one sort of thing people would record for earth resistance. But nevertheless, it's a field that's in there, and so that's what we've been looking at. Otherwise, about 30% or just less for saying what type of software they used, how they interpreted it, and so forth. Some basic location information, the accuracy of how they actually set out a grid. Remember, most of this is from 2001 to 2010, so most people wouldn't have been using NARTI-K GPS. In fact, in the early years, it would mostly be total station, and there are some instances of people using tapes. So we've got instances of that missing. Unforgivably, some people didn't even write the instrument type or the spatial resolution. So, you know, thankfully, it's a very, very minor number there, less than about 1%. So that's all right. But the thing is, the National Roads Authority says in their specification documents that everyone has to adhere to English Heritage Guidance, IFA guidance, despite the fact there's a different jurisdiction, and Armin's guide here. And obviously, not everyone is doing it. Generally, most of the reports were very good quality, but some of them did fall short of the standard that we would expect. Now, this is as close as I come to getting bitter and talking about my competition. Some, unforgivably, this is a figure that was actually produced in a geophysical report, don't include the grayscale, the clip, the dynamic range. Okay, this is how it was produced in the report. I've just omitted some location details, so we don't even know the polarity, although we can obviously guess. So it's very, very dodgy in terms of how they're presenting their data, some people, despite the fact that the same company claims to adhere to all the different guidelines that are actually available. So in some cases they might claim it, but they don't actually adhere to them in practice. This particular company, just for your own point of view, trades in the UK and Ireland. So it's not just an Irish problem, okay? And I'm sure we've all seen lots of examples already about sort of substandard reports in some cases. Interpretation categories, obviously it's very subjective and they vary wildly across the board. Some are very detailed up here. Some are more concerned with describing the anomalies rather than necessarily an archaeological interpretation. Most of them are grand. You wouldn't really complain about any of them. I'm sure you've all seen similar things yourselves. This sort of thing, this traffic light system, and here, high, moderate, and low archaeological potential, that would be the one that would worry me. I don't really agree with that. It doesn't tell you anything about the archaeology as an interpretation. So that's the sort of quality of the reports that we had, generally very good. How successful were the surveys? Well, the vast majority of surveys were magnetometer surveys or unrecorded magnetometer scanning. So as much as I would like to look at how successful Earth resistance was, or GPR, or electromagnetics, unfortunately we just don't have enough excavated examples to correlate with those. So we're actually comparing excavated, ground observed data to detailed and scanned magnetometer anomalies. So the vast majority you can see are magnetometry, and in most cases there weren't really multi-method surveys. They were very thin on the ground. It was completely investing in detailed magnetometry as such. Some of you have heard me talk about how we compare it before in the past, so I'll be very brief. Basically, we don't look at the data, we look at the interpretation, we feed that through a GIS, we also feed the excavation diagrams into the GIS, and we compare those two. And eventually we'll end up with something like this, which tells us true positives, true negatives, and false negatives. We can get statistics out of that, and we can start working out which features that were interpreted were actually there in the excavation, and which features weren't, and so forth, what was missed. What we need to be very careful with are the false positives here in red, something like this. This is where the geophysicist says there are archaeological features here, and the excavators say, oh no, there isn't. Now in this case, apparently the interpretation here says there's lots of internal features inside this room fort feature here. The excavators didn't find anything at all. Now this is where we have to be very careful with this notion of false positives, because actually the inside of this was completely decimated by early 20th century landscaping. So there was nothing for the archaeologists to find on the ground. And in reality, these false positives probably do represent archaeology. So the geophysicist is actually right. And that's quite a significant problem, and it's something we have to get the archaeologists to understand as well. So the geophysicist was actually finding the archaeology, perhaps it's in the topsoil, perhaps there's some remnant anomaly there of the archaeology that's since been destroyed. So it's quite interesting that we actually have that coming up. One of the key drivers we found was geology. What I've done here is I've stripped out all of the geology that Ireland doesn't have as such from England. So you can see we don't have any of the nice chalks and the Triassic and Jurassic deposits that you have. We're dominated by this grey Carboniferous limestone, and we're dominated by sedimentary geology. We've got more in common with Scotland, the very north of England, these parts, Wales and southwest England, than we have with the majority of England. In terms of analysing these true positives and so forth, on average, we found that the geophysical surveys identified 60% of all the archaeological features. Now, this is an average. Depending on which type of geology you go to, those statistics climb up quite significantly. So on sedimentary rocks, for example, 88% success rate for finding individual archaeological features, which is very good as far as I'm concerned. Otherwise, mixtures of sedimentary and metamorphic rock, that drops down to an average of about 34%. But again, it depends on exactly what type of geology you're looking at. For example, if you've got a combination of slate and siltstone, sedimentary and metamorphic, it shoots straight back up to 76%. So it really depends on the individual geologies. I'll leave it pretty much there for geology in this case. There's a poster out in the other room. You can look it all up if you're already interested. The technical accuracy, we actually binned the spatial resolution in terms of how accurate the geophysical interpretation was compared to the location of the excavated data. So everything was found essentially within 2 meters. The majority of it, 25%, was found within 0 to ½ meter. So it's very accurate technical resolution that we've got, technical and spatial resolution that we've got there as well. In terms of the archaeology, what was it very good at identifying? So we're dealing with detailed magnetometry, 1 by ¼ meter resolution. Well, if you want to look for modern drainage channels, we've got 100% hit rate with magnetometry, so MAG is obviously the one you want there. For enclosures, ring forts, field systems, ring ditches for barrows and so forth, it falls between 66 and 83%. Burnt mounds of stone, these are cooking sites, roughly a 50% chance of finding those. They're the most common type of archaeological feature we have in Ireland. all of these are bigger than 5 meters in size. Okay, so they're nice big features. You would expect to find a fairly good contrast for them. So you'd be happy that they're found. Significantly smaller features though, and this is worrying, 93% of what have been described in the interpretations as hearths and pits or pits were missed, and just 25% of kilns were found. So that's really significant. Something's going on there in terms of recognizing or interpreting these small scale features. Now it could be if you're surveying 30 kilometers of road corridor and you've got hundreds of hectares to look at, that perhaps your eye is going to be drawn to the bigger features, perhaps you're not going to bother interpreting some of the small ones. I don't know, that's a possible reason. Enclosures, you'll notice the percentages start falling off for some of these enclosures. On average, 35% of all ditched enclosure type features were missed, and the majority of those were on carboniferous limestone and on poorly draining land. And this is quite significant. So we're talking about ring ditches for barrows, ring forts, circular enclosures, which are about 30 meters in diameter, multi-vallet hill forts. These sorts of things were being missed by detailed magnetometry survey. So that was quite worrying. Magnetometer scanning. Now scanning is an interesting one. As an outsider from Ireland looking in, I'm only aware of anecdotal evidence from the UK, but from what I understand from you all, scanning is now pretty much off the radar as such. Not many people are using it. Geophysicists aren't using it very much. Curators aren't asking for it. In Ireland, I'm sad to say, some consultants are still using it, and for very small survey areas as well. Historically though, obviously in the previous 10 years, the NRA did use scanning, just as pretty much everybody did in this country as well during that period. The NRA used it on about 16% of all their road corridors, and it was the second largest method of assessment after detailed magnetometry. So they cover quite a wide area. So what we've done is we've compared the scanned areas and what was subsequently found in the detailed surveys of those to the archaeological excavations to see what was found, what wasn't found. We carefully trawled the reports because some of the reports will say we found various anomalies here, but we didn't do a detailed survey. So we'd flag that up and say, okay, that counts towards potentially identifying an archaeological site. So we went through that very carefully. 71% of archaeological features were missed by unrecorded magnetometer scanning. Okay, 71%. I've removed the individual road schemes here as I don't want anyone to get offended as such. So we've got 7 different road schemes there. In some cases, you can see there were 10 archaeological sites that were excavated, and they were all missed. In other cases, 26 archaeological sites were assessed by scanning. And they had a hit rate of, or they had a miss rate rather, of 63%. So it varied depending on the road scheme, and obviously it varied depending on the geology as well. No surprises that scanning didn't work at all on alluvium or peat. It didn't work on pure limestone, and that's where we just got the single category of limestone. But where we have limestone and shale over a longer road scheme, it was much more successful. In fact, we had the most number of survey areas on limestone and shale, and for that reason, it was both the most successful geological type for scanning and the most unsuccessful. That's simply because it was the mostly surveyed. In terms of what types of archaeological features were found, 5 sites you wouldn't expect to find via scanning: stone structures and burials. I think we're all happy to say they're not going to be expected to be found. 44 sites were less than 10 meters in size. So we've got 10-meter spaced transects. Technically, all of these features are going to have the potential to fall within those transects and they would be missed. But as it happens, 18% were identified through scanning, 82% were missed. If you compare these lists, they're very similar. The type of sites that were found compared to those that were missed, they're virtually identical. Importantly, 91% of all archaeological features actually excavated on the road schemes were smaller than 10 meters in size. Okay, so the most frequent types of sites that would turn up would not be likely to be assessed by scanning. They'd stand an 18% chance of being found, if you like. 16 sites, though, were much bigger than 10 meters in size, normally 20 or 30 meters. So you would expect at least 2 or 3 transects to hit that when you're doing scanning. Most of them are enclosures, large field systems, moated sites, and 69% of those were identified. 31% were missed. And the ones that were missed were, again, equally big enclosure sites, 30, 40, 50 meters in diameter. Some of them took several weeks to excavate. I think on average 13 weeks to excavate. And importantly, these are the most infrequently found archaeological sites on road schemes. So they only occur 3% of the time, and they're only being identified 69% of the time through scanning. What we found is that the majority of them that were missed were occurring on poorly drained land. And this is quite typical of ring ditch features, where if they're filling up, they're waterlogging. There's nowhere for the water to drain to. That is going to impede the magnetic susceptibility. It's going to reduce the magnetic signal. In some cases, there's not going to be a signal there at all to measure. And that's part of our problem. This is quite significant for Ireland because 1/3 of the country is on poorly drained land. So it helps to explain why a lot of these features are actually being missed. Because of this research, we're then able to come up with a probability, if you like, of the success of scanning in the future. So if we were to say we want to find any type of archaeological site, you're looking at about 29% roughly. Depending on the size of the site, based on this previous research, you can come up with different forms of probability and so forth as well. So if we're out to look for an enclosure or a ring fort larger than 20 meters in size, we stand roughly a 58% chance of identifying it through magnetometer scanning. The key findings of the review then, how am I doing for time? Not too bad. Magnetometer surveys were used very extensively, but sometimes inappropriately, sometimes on the wrong geology, and sometimes for the wrong type of archaeological feature as well. Detailed industry standard magnetometer surveys at 1/4 have on average an 88% success rate on sedimentary geology, which is fairly good. I'm reasonably happy with that. In some cases, on carboniferous limestones though, there is actually no contrast for ditched archaeological features in poorly drained land and so forth. Historically, there does seem to be very poor recognition of these small sites, pits, hearths and so forth, and kilns significantly. So possibly it's because there's an emphasis on interpreting larger archaeological features, and possibly because we have very narrow survey corridors, maybe 30 or 40 meters width. Perhaps the contrasts just aren't there for us to pick out these small scale features. Scanning on average has a 29% success rate of finding archaeology on sedimentary geology. Future applications, I'll miss that for the second because it comes into this section. The same advert that Arne gave for the BAR monograph, we have a similar paper in the same monograph. Look me up on academia and you'll find it. This is one of our major outputs for the NRA. It's essentially a technical review of how well geophysics has worked on the road schemes. The second part of our output for the National Roads Authority is actually a guidance document. And already the draft guidance document that we had completed at the beginning of this year is already indicating a policy shift for the National Roads Authority. They've started introducing high-resolution surveys. They're starting adapting what type of survey techniques they use on challenging geologies. They're using various different types of other techniques. You'll probably have heard me bang on about electromagnetics in the past. They're starting to use that. And at least 5 road schemes have already implemented the advice that's on offer here. Beyond that, non-NRA curators and archaeologists are also beginning to use this document. So it's got a life beyond the NRA. The final thing is Tom Sparrow designed a lovely database that you can go onto online and actually look at all the different geophysical reports. It's been online for almost a year. We've given about 40 people come per month to it. Most importantly, about 34% of the people looking at the website are returning visitors, and that's good because it means it's being used as an educational resource, which is what we wanted, and people can actually learn from it. These are the hits we're getting from the various countries. Unsurprisingly, most interest is from Ireland and the UK. I've talked long enough. I'll leave you with those conclusions. Essentially, what we've done is we've now armed the NRA with information. They can give a good specification for a geophysical survey in any part of Ireland. They can now recognise a good geophysical report from a bad one, and they've got criteria to compare against that. Possibly, and this is really up to you guys, some of the conclusions to this research might actually have ramifications beyond Ireland. Okay, thanks very much.
What to do, whether they want to take a few questions down here or hold off and have tea and then we go on.
Tea, I think.
Right, tea.
Yeah, grand, thank you.
Yeah.